He looked like a comic book villain come to life, all muscle, menace, and mystique. But behind the sculpted jaw and terrifying knockouts was a career that spanned continents, chaos, and controversy. Alistair Overeem wasn't just a fighter. He was an evolution in real time. From lanky teenage striker in Dutch dojos to K-1 Grand Prix champion, from MMA technician to UFC title contender, Overeem reinvented himself so many times, you'd think he was trying to outrun something. Maybe his chin, maybe his critics, maybe himself. He rose in pride, dominated in Strikeforce, conquered K-1, but never quite captured the UFC crown. He was feared, then exposed, admired, then doubted. His name was whispered with awe and suspicion. This is the story of one of combat sport's most complex and dangerous icons, the sculpted savage, the overachiever, the demolition man, Alistair Overeem. Before we start, subscribe the channel to support our growth. Thank you. Alistair Overeem wasn't raised for comfort. He was built in tension, between cultures, between homes, between identities. Born in England to a Jamaican father and Dutch mother, he moved to the Netherlands at a young age after his parents split. While his childhood wasn't a battlefield in the literal sense, it had all the makings of a psychological war zone: instability, identity confusion, and emotional coldness. He didn't talk much, but he listened, and he watched. Mostly his older brother and Valentine, who had already made a name for himself in the underground world of Dutch kickboxing. While most kids were learning to ride bikes or throw footballs, Alistair was studying violence, how it moved, how it struck, how it demanded respect. He was long-limbed, lean, and a little awkward, but there was something in his eyes, something hard, something quiet, something dangerous. He began training in martial arts around 15. Relatively late by combat sports standards, but what he lacked in early years, he made up for in obsession. Muay Thai, judo, boxing, he absorbed it all. And under the guidance of top-level Dutch coaches, his raw frame began to harden into something terrifying. At just 17 years old, he had his first pro MMA fight, and won. He wasn't flashy yet, not even close to Ubereem. He was tall, skinny, but explosive. His technique was rough, but his intent was brutal. And in a country like the Netherlands, where combat sports weren't just accepted but celebrated, Overeem found a home, a tribe. He fought often, against grown men. He didn't always win, but he never backed down. And by his early 20s, he was already on international radars. He signed with Rings and 2H2H in Japan, then quickly transitioned into Pride FC, the coliseum of the MMA world in the early 2000s. What was remarkable about early Overeem wasn't just his athleticism, it was his adaptability. He could outstrike you, he could submit you, he could brawl, he could outthink. And even though his chin occasionally betrayed him, his aura, even in defeat, kept growing. He wasn't a product of hype, he was a result of hunger. A young, quiet technician, slowly sharpening the blade he'd one day swing across 3 continents. But the Overeem that walked into Japan's Pride ring was only the beginning. The world hadn't met the monster yet. The Pride era was no place for the weak. It was where monsters fought in soccer stadiums, where legends were born in blood, and where rules were looser. Knees to the head, soccer kicks, 10-minute opening rounds. This was where Alistair Overeem chose to test himself. And from 2002 to 2006, he fought 13 times under the Pride banner, against the very best the sport had to offer. At just 22, he faced Vitor Belfort and beat him. Then he took on Antonio Rogerio Nogueira, Chuck Liddell, Mauricio Shogun Rua, and Ricardo Arona. These weren't just tough fights. These were career-shaping wars, and they taught Overeem everything about damage, about risk, about how narrow the gap was between glory and unconsciousness. What became clear in Pride was both the promise and the flaw in Overeem's style. He was a fast starter, vicious knees from the clinch, long straight punches, aggressive grappling. His first few minutes were lethal, but if you could survive that storm, you had a shot. Because Overeem had a secret he couldn't hide forever. His chin was made of glass. Time and again, he would dominate the opening round, only to get clipped and crumble. Fans began calling him overhyped, especially after back-to-back knockout losses to Shogun Rua and Arona. But what they missed was what Overeem himself was quietly learning. This game doesn't reward the reckless. It punishes them. He didn't sulk. He didn't retire. He reinvented. By 2006, he had fought over 30 times before turning 27. He had built an international name, not as the best, but as the most dangerous wildcard in MMA. His record wasn't pristine, but his presence was undeniable. And then he grew. not metaphorically, physically. Between 2007 and 2009, Overeem's body transformed. He ballooned from a shredded 205-pound light heavyweight to a hulking 250-pound heavyweight, nearly overnight. The MMA world stared in disbelief. Fans screamed steroids. Overeem kept quiet, but everyone agreed on one thing: he looked terrifying. The Demolition Man had become something else entirely. The world would soon meet Ubereem, the final form of the Dutch monster. But with new power came new enemies and bigger expectations. In 2009, a new creature stepped into the ring. He was no longer the wiry Dutch kickboxer from his Pride days. Alistair Overeem had become a tank in fight shorts. Massive traps, boulder shoulders, horse meat jokes flooding the forums. The man looked like a bodybuilder, fought like a Terminator, and talked like a polite assassin. And with that came his most dangerous transformation, into a legitimate world beater. He moved between organizations like a ghost, collecting wins in Dream, Strikeforce, and most importantly, K-1. The K-1 Grand Prix wasn't just a kickboxing tournament. It was the kickboxing tournament. No takedowns, no grappling, just striking, against the best in the world. Overeem entered in 2009, but fell short. In 2010, he came back with vengeance. In one night, he defeated Tyrone Spong, Gokhan Saki, and Peter Ertz, three of the best strikers alive. He became the first fighter in history to win major world titles in MMA and K1. He wasn't just hype now, he was history. Meanwhile, in Strikeforce, he bulldozed through the competition. Paul Buentello, Brett Rogers, Fabricio Werdum all fell. He claimed the Strikeforce heavyweight championship and was now knocking on the UFC's door. But his reputation was murky. The physical transformation, the dominance, the speed, it was too perfect. And when reporters asked about steroids, Overeem deflected. Horse meat, he'd smirk. Fans laughed. Critics didn't. The UFC finally signed him in 2011. And for his debut, they gave him Brock Lesnar, another freak athlete, another man with questions swirling around him. What followed was brutal. Overeem folded Lesnar with a knee to the liver and finished him with a crushing body kick. Just like that, Overeem was the UFC's most feared heavyweight. He called out Junior Dos Santos. Dana White nodded. But behind the scenes, trouble was brewing. A random drug test revealed Overeem's testosterone levels were over 14.1, more than double the legal limit. The title shot vanished. He was suspended. And suddenly, the monster who conquered Japan, Holland, and the kickboxing world was painted as a fraud. The downfall hadn't started yet, but the cracks were showing. He had built a new body, a new legacy. But now, the weight of expectation and the truth were catching up to him fast. When Alistair Overeem returned from his suspension in 2012, the hype hadn't died, but the trust had. His shredded physique, his terrifying power, and his dominance in kickboxing were still there. But the shadow of the failed drug test loomed. The UFC scheduled his comeback for early 2013. The opponent, Antonio Bigfoot Silva, dangerous but beatable, a perfect comeback on paper. And for 2 rounds, it was just that. Overeem battered Bigfoot, toyed with him, hands down, chin out, sneering like it was a sparring match. The arrogance was thick. He looked invincible until he didn't. In round 3, Bigfoot exploded with a brutal flurry that left Overeem stiff on the canvas. Just like that, the illusion cracked. The knockout was shocking, not just because of the loss, but because of how it happened. Overeem had dominated, then got caught. Same pattern, same weakness. That chin, again. His next fight, Travis Brown. Another loss, another knockout. He had Brown hurt badly early, nearly finished the fight. But when the storm passed, Brown delivered a front kick that folded Overeem in place. 2 fights, 2 wins that slipped away. 2 reminders that no matter how powerful you are, timing, patience, and a good chin can't be faked. Fans started doubting again. Ubereem is gone. He's just muscle and memories. He returned against Frank Mir in 2014, this time fighting cautiously. He won a decision, but looked flat. The aggression was gone. Confidence shaken. The ream was fading. Then, in 2014, a brutal KO loss to Ben Rothwell. More doubt, more memes. The word chin became a curse word for his legacy. The UFC had invested millions in Overeem, but every fight felt like a dice roll. Either he dominates or he gets decapitated. There was no middle ground. And that's when Overeem made a decision that changed everything. He left behind the chaos, the yes men, the ego, and joined Jackson Wink MMA in Albuquerque, home of thinkers, home of strategy. If Overeem wanted to last, He had to become smarter than the game that kept breaking him. The muscles weren't saving him anymore. But Overeem wasn't done evolving. At Jackson Wink, Overeem found something he'd never had in abundance: humility. There, under Greg Jackson and Mike Winkeljohn, fighters like John Jones and Holly Holm weren't just training, they were studying film, angles, movement, psychology. Overeem, now in his mid-30s, was no longer chasing youth. He was chasing understanding. And for the first time in years, he looked different. Gone was the berserker. In his place, a tactician. Overeem's new style emphasized lateral movement, distance control, and carefully timed attacks. He used feints, he kicked more, he stayed disciplined, and he stopped taking unnecessary risks. The result? A string of smart, decisive wins. He beat Stefan Struve, outclassed Roy Nelson, knocked out Junior Dos Santos with a beautiful left hook, a statement. Then he dismantled Andrei Arlovsky. Just like that, Overeem was on a 4-fight win streak, and the UFC couldn't deny it anymore. In 2016, Overeem got what he had always wanted: a shot at the UFC heavyweight title. The opponent? Stipe Miocic, the champion who had just dethroned Fabrizio Werdum. It was set. Overeem versus Miocic. Legacy on the line. Early in the fight, Overeem dropped Miocic with a left hand. The crowd gasped. He went for the guillotine, but Miocic escaped. What followed was 3 minutes of pressure, pace, and punishment. Stipe cornered him, and then a right hand detonated on Overeem's jaw. He was out again. After the fight, Overeem controversially claimed Miocic tapped. The replay showed otherwise. It wasn't just a physical loss. It was a hit to his credibility. A chance at redemption, gone. But Overeem didn't disappear. He kept fighting, kept adapting. He beat Mark Hunt with a vicious knee, took out Fabrizio Werdum again. At 37 years old, Overeem was still ranked top 5, still dangerous. But the margin of error at heavyweight is razor thin. And one punch was coming from a monster with sledgehammers in his hands. His mind had evolved, his game had matured, but his chin? That would always be the question. December 2nd, 2017, Detroit, UFC 218. Alistair Overeem walked into the octagon to face a rising star from Cameroon, Francis Ngannou. Undefeated in the UFC, built like a tank, known for knocking people into next week. It was billed as a clash of styles: experience versus raw power, craft versus chaos. Overeem had the tools, the IQ, the resume. What he didn't have was time. In the very first round, Ngannou landed an uppercut from hell, one of the most violent knockouts in UFC history. Overeem's head snapped back violently. His body crumpled before it hit the ground. It was terrifying. Final, a punch that went viral. Overeem lay unconscious for several minutes. Even his haters went quiet. That wasn't a loss. That was a message. The old guard must fall. But Overeem, ever resilient, came back again. In 2019, he fought Jairzinho Rozenstruik for 24 minutes. He dominated, clinched, struck smart, avoided danger. He was seconds away from a decision win. And then, boom, Rozenstruik landed a right hand that literally exploded Overeem's lip, split it clean in half. With just 4 seconds left on the clock, the fight was stopped. Another knockout loss, another viral meme. How do you keep getting up after that? Most fighters wouldn't, but Overeem wasn't most fighters. He kept winning, beating Augusto Sakai, Sergey Pavlovich, and Walt Harris. And each time, he looked calm, composed, professional, like a man who had seen too much to ever panic again. But Father Time doesn't care how smart you fight or how many times you've evolved. In 2021, Overeem faced Alexander Volkov, a younger, fresher, faster striker. It was clinical. Volkov picked him apart, round by round. No huge KO, no drama, just slow erosion. Overeem was outgunned, out-timed, out of answers. And that was it. He was quietly released by the UFC. No tribute, no send-off, just a silent ending for one of the most complex careers in MMA history. But even after 20 years of blood, belts, and broken bones, the Demolition Man wasn't quite finished just yet. After his UFC release in 2021, most assumed Alistair Overeem would hang up the gloves. And how could you blame him? Over 65 pro fights, multiple titles, a body carved by pain, a chin carved by time. But Overeem never viewed retirement as a destination. To him, it was just another transition. So in typical Overeem fashion, he did what no one expected. He went back to the beginning, back to kickboxing, back to the art that started it all. In 2022, Overeem signed with Glory Kickboxing, returning to a sport he had once conquered in the most brutal tournament on earth, K-1. Now 42 years old, carrying decades of battle, he was no longer Ubereem. He was something else. Maybe wiser, maybe slower, but definitely still dangerous. His comeback fight wasn't against a tune-up. It was against Badr Hari, a former rival and one of the most feared strikers in history. Their 2008 fight ended with Overeem knocking Hari out cold. 14 years later, they were both older, heavier, and haunted by what could have been. But that night was magic. For 3 rounds, Overeem and Hari traded leather like it was 2009 again. Slipping shots, throwing bombs. Overeem got dropped early, but rallied back. In round 3, he surged, flooring Hari twice, securing the decision. For a moment, it felt like the fairy tale ending. Old-school fans rejoiced. Combat sports purists called it a classic. Overeem, bruised but smiling, looked like a man who had finally found peace. But as always with Overeem, peace never lasts long. Months later, the result was overturned. Overeem had failed a drug test. Glory suspended him. The win was erased from his record. And just like that, the fairy tale crumbled. Again, the headlines wrote themselves, "Caught again." The cycle repeats. He'll never learn. Whether it was intentional doping or residue from past treatments, fans didn't care. In the court of public opinion, Overeem had crossed the line. Again. And this time, there was no UFC to run back to. No Strikeforce. No dream. No pride. Just a legacy. Bruised, buried under doubt, and hanging by a thread. The monster had finally slowed, but his shadow still loomed large. And as the fight world moved on, one question refused to die. What will we remember? Alistair Overeem's resume is unparalleled. 47 MMA wins, K-1 Grand Prix champion, Dream Heavyweight champion, Strikeforce Heavyweight champion, UFC title contender, over 65 professional fights across nearly 3 decades. On paper, he's a combat sports titan, but legacy isn't built on paper. It's built on moments, on perception, on memory. And for Overeem, those memories are complicated. Some remember the brutal KOs, the flying knees, the guillotines, the head kicks. Others remember the failures, the chin, the collapses, the accusations. Some call him the most talented heavyweight never to win UFC gold. Others say he was always overrated, carried by hype and hormones. Then there's the elephant in the room, PEDs. Overeem never tested positive officially during his K-1 Grand Prix run, but his body transformation from 2006 to 2010 raised every eyebrow in the business. The 2012 failed test in the UFC was confirmation for many. The glory suspension just reopened the wounds. To some, it tarnished everything. But here's the paradox. Overeem still fought everyone. Clean or not, he stood toe-to-toe with the best of multiple generations, from Chuck Liddell and Vitor Belfort to Stipe Miocic and Francis Ngannou. He was never protected, never pampered. He was the final boss in 3 different sports. And he adapted more times than most fighters even get to compete. So what do you do with a legacy like that? Do you erase the glory because of the cracks? Or do you admire the man who kept fighting, even as the world questioned everything about him? Overeem's name doesn't come up in GOAT conversations. Not for UFC, not for MMA as a whole, but his impact, that's harder to ignore. He was the first European heavyweight to break into global consciousness. The first man to win elite kickboxing and MMA titles simultaneously. The first fighter whose transformation made fans question what was humanly possible, for better or worse. In the end, Overeem's legacy may not be clean, but it's unforgettable, and maybe that's its own kind of immortality. Today, Alistair Overeem lives quietly. No major announcements, no flashy interviews, no podcast, no fight bookings, just silence. After nearly 25 years in combat sports, the man known as the Demolition Man has finally stepped out of the spotlight. Not with a bang, but a whisper. He hasn't officially retired. He hasn't released a memoir. He just vanished. And in that silence, a strange thing happened. The world moved on. New names rose. Ngannou left the UFC. John Jones took the heavyweight throne. Fans on social media began comparing Cyril Gane and Tom Aspinall, barely remembering the wars Overeem fought to pave the way for them. But in certain gyms, especially in Europe, Overeem's name still carries weight. He visits occasionally, mentors quietly, offers advice only when asked. He's not chasing cameras anymore. He's chasing peace. For a man who spent 2 decades being questioned, mocked, doubted, and celebrated, maybe peace was all he ever really wanted. There are no statues of Overeem, no UFC Hall of Fame plaque, no gold belt on his mantle, but in the eyes of fighters who came after him, his shadow is still there. Not perfect, but present. Not untouchable, but undeniable. Because Alistair Overeem didn't just fight for titles. He fought for relevance across countries, weight classes, and eras. And in a sport that forgets its heroes fast, he's still remembered. You can question his record, you can question his methods, but don't ever question his heart. Because Alistair Overeem walked through fire for over 2 decades. And though he didn't always win, he never ran from the flames.